C'est déjà en route, oui. T'es-tu là-dedans? Yeah. Morning.
Yeah.
I used to have a pyramid that, but I don't have one anymore. The microphone. That's then that goes your microphone. Otherwise, your microphone's built into your computer.
Good morning,
Yes,
everyone.
I gave it to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Try to do this. It went away.
Good morning.
Morning, Sarah.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well. Happy Friday.
Thanks. You too. Nice and sunny there. I'm
It
just
is.
noticing.
It's beautiful here today, and apparently it's going to get quite warm for the weekend. So I'm really.
Oh, hang on. I have a problem with my volume there. Want to repeat that for me?
Yeah, I just said I'm looking forward to the weekend. I think that the weather is going to be really lovely here and get finally some warmer temperatures.
Yeah, I think it'll be nice here too. So it's a beautiful day. Just gorgeous here today.
Awesome.
No clouds and
we need this.
yeah, we need a win.
Yeah.
It's looking good though. I mean, locally we have a 50% of people who have their first shots.
Wow.
It's exciting.
Yeah, that is very exciting.
Yeah.
Excellent.
See kind of the light at the end of the tunnel. So.
How one can hope.
What's the vaccination? Has there been like an uptick on the vaccination there?
I am not 100% sure. I did see that people are eligible now if they're over 40, and you can get on the waiting list if you're over 35, I think. So exciting.
I checked last week and I think you had a higher percentage of people who had both of their doses, but a much lower percentage who had one. So last I checked, you were at 9% who had both doses and only 7% who had the first. So that just made me wonder, you know, is that it?
I don't know. I know that the vaccination has been open for community members for a while, so I'm not sure.
So it'll be interesting to see the progress. I hope that there's an improvement on that from your end for your own, you know, community health and safety.
It's also now open for federal school staff can get a vaccination as well.
Nice. Okay, so should we get started?
Also, we're just going to mention too, I don't think those numbers are really reflective because in the beginning, a lot of our people went off the reserve for their shot as well.
That's
and it was recommended by health services here. They were sending people to different places in the neighboring counties. So the numbers are probably higher that have had both.
Right.
Yeah.
That's amazing to hear.
Mm-hmm. So Lynn, whenever you're ready, please feel free to take it away.
Okay, I'm just going to try and place you guys. I think we're going to have to stop people's videos just because of that bandwidth issue. So if you don't mind just kind of shutting off your video and trying to figure out where to place you on my screen here. There we go. See myself a little bit. Okay, so definitely welcome back to this fourth series in the Exceptionality series. Today we're going to be reviewing again the communication learning disability category because there's so much variability. I wanted to give you a sense of what that looks like. So I'm going to try and find, feeling technically challenged today. I guess I made my screen so tiny that I can't find the share button. There we go. Okay. That is perfect. Okay, so just to review what to expect when someone has a diagnosis of learning disability. I just want to make sure that you guys don't see this. No, that's okay. I'll move it. Okay, so let's just start over. I want to go over what it looks like when a child has a learning disability, what you expect from them in the long run. So having an LD means, by definition, that they're developing normally, that they're typically developing kids. And so I know a lot of the times you're worried about that diagnosis being provided, but it's actually a really good sign. And if everyone understands that that means they're developing normally, then I think it would be accepted more readily. With the right accommodations, the sky's the limit. They can do whatever they want and whatever their level of intelligence and their skills allow them to do. It will, of course, depend not only on their intelligence, but also their life skills, their ability to socialize, their ability to be persistent, flexible, adaptable. So again, IQ is not the end all be all. But they can think and reason as well as others, so they will be able to make connections and demonstrate their intelligence. Sometimes their processing abilities limit their ability to show what they can do, but they almost always find ways to circumvent that weakness, to go around it. So when I provide these tests, I administer them in a manner that is standardized and they're previously normed. And I really find it helpful to go over those terms rather than do a poll now. I'll try and remember to do an either at the end of this session or the next one. But I thought, you're all teachers, maybe this is more of a verbal explanation that I need to give. So I looked up just a more specific definition of that. So standardization is the word we use to explain consistency and objectivity in the tests that we administer and in the way we score them. In order to compare one person to another person on the test, it's important that those people take the test under the same conditions and that the scoring procedure is applied equally to both. So for example, if you're taking a test in a really hot room and you're sweating and you're focused on that, you're not going to be able to have the same results as someone who is taking the test in a room with a normal temperature. So like if you think about it, because you can't think when you're warm, things don't go, which reminds me, I forgot my fan. So another example would be to consider the noise level. So if, let's say we're doing a math test and one child is taking the math test in a thunderstorm where it's very loud, and the other is taking a math test in a soundproof room, can we go and compare the results? And can we, in all honesty, know, is it fair to say that the person who took the test in the thunderstorm condition is lower because of their ability, or is it regarding the fact that they had difficulty concentrating in those conditions? What if we applied different scoring criteria to each of the test takers? Then could we say who was better in math? So this is why standardization is so important in testing. It's also why when we go to the school to do testing, we're very adamant about where we're testing, the conditions, the noise levels, the people coming in. So that changes the standard procedure and it just makes it difficult to compare results. So we do it with good intent. The tests are normed. Test norms include data that make it possible to determine where one person stands compared to the group of people who took the test ahead of time. So the results usually fall within this normal curve. And I liked the way this one was changed up because it really shows that at this in the middle here, and I hope you can see my pointer, we have about 68% of people, and that's the bulk of the people. So if you can see the percentile rank at the bottom, the average range goes from about the 16th person to the 84th person. And so there's about 68 people out of 100 that are all crammed into this space. Whereas here you have 1 and 2. Here you have 99 and 100. And here you have from the 3rd percentile to the 15th percentile. So like 14 people spread out within the same distance. And so what we're really looking for is when there's a deficit, we would say it's at the 1st and 2nd percentile compared to the rest of the group. So that would be considered something that's an area of deficit. So that's that concept kind of presented in a new way. Some common characteristics I want to talk about, and we talked about last time, but there's no harm in reviewing. They have essential abilities for thinking and reasoning. They're not functioning as well as expected given those thinking and reasoning abilities. And there's a processing deficit that's identified that can explain that discrepancy. So it is the most interesting part of my job, trying to do this deductive piece. So that said, let's look at case number 1. And that first page has a cheat sheet for you, which I'm going to take a time out and actually load these notes to the chat. So if you want to take a little brain break. Oops, that's probably confidential. I'm going to stop that share. Sorry about that. I meant to put that up while we were chatting. And I cannot find it.
Lynn, while you're looking for that, do you mind if I ask a question?
Sure.
It's Jennifer. I was under the understanding that the IQ score, which the lower end for normal is 90, that for the LD designation was allowed to drop down below that now, that's a recent change.
Yeah, that's a big conversation. Let me try and find this LD handout. So that I can't find it. So sorry, guys. I'm gonna have to give that to you after the fact. I hope that's okay. So Jennifer, what you're talking about is the difference between the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, which states that you only need to not have a developmental disability in order to qualify for a specific learning disability. But in school psychology, we don't follow the DSM-5. We follow the Ontario Psychological Association guidelines for school psychology that state that you have to have at least average intelligence. Now, the average intelligence is flexible and is reserved based on clinical judgment. So the actual average is 85 to 115. That's like the statistical average, with 100 being the mean and 15 being the standard deviation. So you have from the yeah, so what I just said. It's 85 to 115. So from the 16th, I think, percentile to the 84th. That's all considered average. And also there's the possibility to make a determination about the presence of average intellectual ability. That's also a clinical judgment based on the results that we get. So in the OPA definition of learning disability, they don't understand why you would not have to have indication of average intelligence. Because without it, how are you going to access those accommodations? Okay, so we're going to talk about that for the rest of the time, but not that specificity. So thanks for asking. Okay, so this is a case who is learning disability, case number 1. And these cases, I think there are 3 of them. They're all your kids. So, you know, proof positive, definitely not all of these kids are coming out MID or slow learners. This is a child with phonological awareness deficits, processing speed deficits, rapid naming deficits, and executive functions deficits. So I will show you the graph. I'm not sharing, am I? Let's try again. Okay, can you see that? Okay, I'll take that as a yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so slide number 11. So if we move this little block over here, so this is the average range, and I put a block around the average range, the large average range, so from 85 to 115, so to be as inclusive as possible. So we see this little guy who has completely average intellectual ability. So his general ability, which is looking at his verbal comprehension, his visual, spatial, and his fluid reasoning, kind of all combined, falls average, and all of the areas fall nice and solidly in the average range. So then we look at these kind of processes that are still supporting his learning, but they're processes. So his working memory. So this child can hold information in mind and manipulate it. So when you're talking in class, that shouldn't really be a problem based on this measure right here. Also, his verbal memory for stories is a little bit lower, but still kind of within the average range. So when he hears something, for all intents and purposes, he can remember what he's heard and relay it back to you. And he has a really nice visual memory, so he can remember things he sees and what they look like. So far, so good. These are all the other processes that support learning. And this is where you can see that definitely this child has areas that are not helping him and that are likely causing problems. So we see his phonological awareness is extremely low compared to other people, and definitely compared to his overall ability to think and reason. So that's phonological awareness. Normally we would predict problems with reading and writing if you have problems with phonological awareness. And together with this rapid naming is the ability to just look at letters and numbers and quickly rhyme them off. Sometimes we do it if they can't read yet. Sometimes we just do it with colors or objects, and we compare how quickly that they can do that. So you see how that's not a thinking and reasoning, it's just retrieval of information and spitting it out verbally. So that's a problem for this child. He has a little bit of difficulty with his attention, but when you really look deeper into it, it's more of an executive functions issue where he has a hard time stopping himself from responding. So those are different areas. And then finally, he has this weakness in his processing speed. Processing speed is a measure where I'm simply copying. So if I give you something to copy, how quickly can you copy it compared to other kids? And so it's very similar to copying words off of the board. So some kids who can't read can still do that properly. So given this, let's look at his, I'm gonna just like squint in because it's tiny for me. We see, like, against all odds, this child is reading. So someone has, figured out, and this is really what we're talking about in terms of like learning disabilities, because you have the weakness and you somehow learn to circumvent it. With him, or her, I'm forgetting who this is. This memory probably came and supported this reading comprehension. And so here we have writing in kind of the green, and we see this is where it's starting to fall apart for this kiddo. So he can't spell individual words, but if you give him two sentences, he has all of the intelligence to be able to put them together to fit and make one well-written sentence. But that's having a model. So this dot over here, the next one that's outside of the average range, would represent his ability to generate a sentence himself, which is much lower than the average, but much lower than his own ability to speak even. And then it goes further into deficit when we look at his ability to write essays. So when you're asking him to write essays, all of these weaknesses are coming together and making it extremely difficult for him. Given this fluid reasoning, you would expect average math. So fingers crossed here, that's not quite working for him. So he has good numerical operations, but it takes him a long time. What's making it take a long time? It's this rapid naming and the processing speed that's making him, when we look at this lowest dot here as his fluency, so his addition and subtraction fluency, that is a task that's super simple because I'll give you a page of like 1 + 1, 2 + 1, 3 + 4. They're very basic. And I give you a minute and I want to compare how many of those you can do compared to other kids your age. And so kids with MID who know how to add and subtract can do this. Some kids with LD, especially if they have a processing speed weakness, cannot. And so he's definitely not succeeding as well as expected in math either. Just want to go to kind of I copied and pasted from these reports. So what I would say is that these results show that this child is just as smart as other kids his age. He has the abilities essential for thinking and reasoning. He's acquiring appropriate amounts of knowledge. He's retaining information. He's understanding the world around him, both visually and verbally. However, he has multiple challenges that have an impact on his ability to learn at the same pace as would be expected, especially in the area of writing. So namely, he has weaknesses with his processing speed, both visual motor and rapid naming. He has issues with his executive functions and his phonological awareness that impact on his academic output in writing, and to a lesser degree in math and reading fluency. The fluency is not here for reading, but he definitely was not reading nicely and fluently. So although this child has a really great memory for short amounts of verbal and visual information, if it's too long, it seems to take more time to process and organize. So what this means is when the cognitive load increases, so when the demand of the task, such as in a writing task, so you have to like integrate multiple pieces of information and keep that information in mind and attend to it simultaneously. Even though he has no working memory issues, he struggles to do that similarly to his peers. He has these weaknesses in phonological processing that are very consistent with spelling. And when combined, the greatest impact is really noted in his writing ability. So he met criteria for diagnosis of learning disability in the area of written expression. And we also suspected that he would struggle with longer reading tasks as time went on. And I struggled to explain why he's not succeeding in math. And so we didn't additionally give him that diagnosis. So what would we recommend in the classroom for this child? So I'll try and focus on just a few of them. It's not inclusive of all of the recommendations, but assistive technology is the key for a child with this level of intellect. So when you remove the barriers by providing these tools, it's almost like providing a wheelchair to someone who can't walk, right? They can now travel because of the wheelchair. So word prediction software will likely be very helpful for him. And he'll just need training on how to use it. Speech to text would be really great for him as well. Other things you can do to compensate for these executive functions weaknesses in conjunction with all the struggles he's having is index cards when writing. So when you're following the writing process with this student, I might encourage him to use index cards for writing ideas down. So having a different index card for topics and subtopics and details, because he might have really good ideas and he's very creative, but very unorganized. So as you're writing one idea per card, then it's a second. So it's in a sense, you're chunking the task. It's a second process to then look at it and say, this idea is good. Where does it go? Like, do I have ideas that fit together? So just making it very easy to manipulate. So you can spread them out, you can move them around, you can cluster them as appropriate before writing. You can color code them. So these are organizational strategies that are very useful to teach to a child with executive functions, because then they can just soar. Yeah, so also you're gonna let him demonstrate knowledge through means other than written work, knowing how much energy it takes. You know, can you have him record himself and explain what he has to say or explain his understanding? If you have to have a writing assignment, give him a mark for his creativity and give him a mark for the mechanics so that he can at least see the things that he's good at. And tell him, you know, you can have a secretary. Like if you need someone, you can do spell check. There are ways around not spelling properly. And you have the ability to learn to organize your thoughts. So it will progress. You would allow, I would recommend oral testing when the primary emphasis is on the development of knowledge as opposed to reading or writing. And in this way, the child is going to be able to show you what they can do. And you're going to be surprised. You might consider a list or tasks the same way we did for the MID child, but this would look different. So we would cover all the steps to help him figure out the different steps that he might need to do in a project, such as like first write all the ideas you have on a single card, for example. Then I want you to sort. So these are all different tasks. And if you can teach them to do one task and get rewarded for it by being able to check it off and move forward, then it becomes less daunting.
Can I ask another question? I'm sorry to keep
Yes.
bothering.
No, this is perfect.
So our students who have been diagnosed with an LD in reading, I think through all the schools do BAS testing. That's where they have to do a segment on decoding, and then there's a comprehension conversation that has to happen. That doesn't give us a true score for our LD learners. It seems to me that it would be much better to have the story read to them and assess just their comprehension. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't recommend that because it's not about the end score, right? We still want them to learn to read. We still want to track their development in their decoding. But what we want to do is do that aside. So I like to recommend like an alternative curriculum where you're maybe doing that and teaching decoding skills to this child so that he can still progress. But the child still has access to regular reading material within the classroom. And that's where I would recommend the information be read to him, so that if everyone's reading a book, that book is read to him, or he has an audio version. And in that way, he's allowed to participate and be stimulated intellectually and share all of his good thoughts with the class regarding that book. So that's where kind of the discrepancy happens. You don't want to stop teaching the basic reading skills, and you don't want to have him not participate in class with the others. Did that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
And it's a good question, because there's one thing for learning disability that I wish everyone would remember. So the take-home message is you have to provide them with access to all of the same learning opportunities as your other kids who don't have LD. They can understand those concepts. They can understand the same reading material. The problem is the actual reading part of it. So if you make them keep reading a much lower book, whereas everyone else is reading higher level books, that's where you're putting them at a disadvantage and not doing them any favors. But you also have to reserve some time for them to try and pick up speed there. Okay, and just one last little note on the executive functions. Goal, plan, do, review, something that I talk about a lot. This model teaches a child to visually set the goal, recognize, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Will you have barriers? How will you overcome them? Set the goal for yourself. Sometimes if they can't read, then I say like a visual pick list. Develop a plan, self-monitor for goals, and I can definitely share that. Goal, plan, do, review with you. But you have to model that process. Okay. So here's a different case, auditory working memory and phonological processing and rapid naming. So very similar. Again, I have this little block here showing the average range from 85 to 115. Again, one of your little kiddos. And yeah, that's why I was kind of wondering about whether or not I can share these. That's what happened with the handout. Because I was reflecting on, is anyone going to recognize any of these profiles? Look at this guy. So when you look at his general intellectual ability, so his verbal comprehension is just at the bottom of the average range. His visual spatial reasoning is 85. And when you ask him to figure out the rules and really analyze the situation visually, he is like heads and tails above everyone else. amazing. So with this, you're thinking, no problem, no problemo. And he has all of these other areas that are great for him. I'm going to lean in so I can read that. He has a really good verbal memory for stories, which I also, along with the visual spatial usually being high, I see in your kind of culture with the history of storytelling. Seems to always be well developed. I can't see that. Visual memory, his visual memory is average. His processing speed, super tiny, is average. And so one hint, like this is like a background information for y'all. The more I do, the more difficulty I had figuring out what was going on with the child. And so the more I do, then the smaller it is. So if I'm squinting, it's because we did a lot of testing. He understands as well as other kids. When you tell him information, he can repeat it. And let's squint in here. Executive functions, look at that. He can plan and organize himself at the high end of the average range. So like so far, nothing's wrong with this little guy. His math reasoning and his numerical operations are progressing well. And here we have writing. So he has essay writing that is amazing. So he can pull together information, it's creative. He has as many words, if not more, than the majority of your kids. When you ask him to pull sentences together, that's harder for him. So you're coming into the bottom of the average range here, but really starts to fall apart when you look at the grammar and mechanics. So he's not remembering, for some reason, the punctuation capitals, and he's not remembering what the words look like. So he's not spelling properly. I'm saying he's not remembering what the words look like, but really it's going to be a surprise to me because it's behind this box. Not sure why. And then you see, for some reason, he's not reading. He's not decoding well. He's not understanding what he's reading. So obviously, because I know we moved forward with an LD diagnosis, these are the processing areas that are deficit for him. So his auditory working memory. So that's his ability to hear information and manipulate it. So some of the things we do for that are just tell me what numbers I say. That's just short-term memory. But an auditory working memory is, here are the numbers, tell them to me backwards. Or here are the numbers, rearrange them in order from smallest to largest. Or even better, here are some letters and numbers. Remember them all, but first tell me the numbers, then tell me the letters. So it's not a thinking and reasoning task. It's really just your ability to remember what was said and manipulate it. That's hard for him. And then the phonological memory. So that's a very similar. So I had 2-3 good measures of that to substantiate that disability. And although he had a really good memory for stories, when I presented him with unrelated lists, he struggled to remember those even when given multiple trials. And so he's not associating, his associational memory is not great. And also we have the big two, phonological awareness and rapid naming. Those are two processes that almost always, if there's a deficit, indicate that there's going to be a difficulty with reading and spelling. And phonological awareness is a simple task, a simple set of 3 tasks. And what I do is, so I'm going to say 2 parts of a word. You tell me what word I'm trying to say. Cow, boy. So you guys all do it when it's a younger, when they're in like JKSK, cowboy. Except it just gets more and more complicated, like like a 10 syllable word eventually. And kids can remember that if they don't have this phonological awareness problem. Another part of phonological awareness would be deletion. So, if I say table, and so say table, now say table, but take out the b. So can you say tail? Can you make that manipulation in your mind? And this child couldn't. And time and time again, these are issues that we find related to reading and difficulty reading. And again, the rapid naming, which I mentioned last time, which is still a problem for this child. And the last one, English receptive vocabulary. So receptive vocabulary is different than thinking and reasoning skills. So thinking and reasoning, when you explain to me how 2 words go together, it doesn't have to be eloquent, right? So it's not really a language ability that I'm looking at. You can say it to me, and as long as I understand that you're getting the concept, I'm not querying the quality of your speech. So that's how kind of verbal comprehension is different than language per se. And with receptive language, it's a simple task where I'm telling you a word and asking you, can you pick from these 4 pictures, which word is represented, like which picture represents the word. So the breadth of vocabulary can have an impact specifically on your reading comprehension. So if his vocabulary were to be the focus of intervention, you might think that his reading comprehension might increase. But all of those difficulties pulled together represent a learning disability. So this child's academic skills in reading, decoding, reading comprehension, spelling, and mechanics, so grammar and punctuation, were all below the average range and much weaker than expected given his average level thinking and reasoning skills. He has specific psychological processing deficits with auditory working memory and to a lesser degree, phonological awareness and rapid naming, which are all logically related to his ongoing difficulties developing those academic skills. This child, I would say, has an incredible strength, and I call it actually intuition when they're this smart. So what that means is it's a child who, when you explain something with, let's say, regards to, it's not Legos because that's more visual spatial, but how things connect and interconnect, when he hears it for the first time, he might say like, I kind of knew that. So he's really intuitive, creative, he's sociable, he had high cognitive flexibility. He had interesting topics to write about when he wasn't concerned about what people think. And so when you have these kinds of discrepancies, that's when you start creeping in with these behaviors where the child might avoid the work. They might feel like they're not as smart as other kids. So it's so important to know what their potential is, because if they're doing the best they can, then that's what we work with. But if there's a discrepancy, then we want to be able to lift them up with these accommodations so they can show us what they can do. And then they'll be happier and their behaviors will dissipate. Okay, so additional supports, I would probably recommend all the first list. Then I would add support for his auditory working memory. One thing you can do is encourage active reading. So we know that if the child is reading actively and then it's connecting with other things, then they're going to be able to, like I said, circumvent that auditory working memory deficit. So these kids who are this bright, you're giving them highlighters, sticky notes, you're asking them to read a certain amount. Or even in this case, if he's reading a book with the class, you would give him all those tools, he'd be listening to it, and you would instruct him to pause. Listen for like a minute, pause, write down, write pictures if you can't write specific words. If you're following along with the text, highlight particular things that you think are important, and then continue. So you're becoming very active in the process. You're going to try and teach them to think in pictures and think in colors. You're going to try and teach them to visualize. Sorry. I'm going to try and teach him to visualize so that he can compensate for the fact that the words are not sticking, but it seems like visually he does really well. Encourage memory aids, what we do, lists, organizers, mind maps. How does this that you just learned fit together with something else? So you're going to activate them. Oral testing, again, when the emphasis is on development of knowledge. Dual grades, again. Break down the writing steps and reward the completed chunks. Oh my goodness. Okay. Any questions about that? I'll quickly do the next one if we don't. This one's pretty spectacular as well. Also one of your kiddos. Verbal and auditory deficits. So this child, I configured differently because it was such a different profile. This is a severe language disorder. So this child came to us with a diagnosis of developmental disability from a young age. So this is one of the topics we were talking about last week. And I can see why this was seen. So what I did was all of the red are the nonverbal abilities, and all of the blue, I think, are anything related to verbal. So if I kind of skim this away, you can see that everything that's in the red falls pretty much average, with some exception with the math, but he still has some math abilities within the average range. And everything from verbal comprehension to auditory working memory, anything to do with language is not great. It's a whole different kid. And so his reading and his writing are not progressing well. So this kid is really difficult to service because he's not a typical child with LD, but he does have average thinking and reasoning skills, but he can't access that reasoning through the verbal modality. So he has generalized difficulty with verbal and auditory processing, and the diagnosis here would be severe language disorder. And also I would provide a diagnosis of LD. So not because of this split, but because he's really not succeeding as well as expected, definitely in math. So, and there are other areas of functioning that explain that. Specifically, his phonological processes are not supporting his literacy skills. And he has severe problems with attention, focus, and concentration to task, which additionally impact him. So on top of the language disorder that explains his very slow academic process, a learning disability was provided. And the student's academic achievement without accommodation remains really low, much lower than predicted. So he really checks off all the boxes for both. However, this child's going to need a lot of resource support. And I would recruit the speech language pathologist to support his language development. But when he is in class, because we do know that's still something that is extremely useful for him, we encourage him to use assistive technology to help improve his abilities. But know that that's not going to be the same as with other LDs. So this is going to help improve his functioning, but it's not going to bring him up to the average range and just magically make it go away. You're still going to need to compensate for the verbal weakness. So you're going to still do all of the things you might have done with a child with MID. So use concrete words, short phrases, help him demonstrate knowledge in visual ways. You're going to follow his visual interests. So try and let him lead and try and incorporate your teachings into things that he's showing he's capable of doing. Oral testing is going to be a must as well. But again, when he gives the information, it's still going to be so much lower and very similar to a child with MID. But you're going to encourage a growth mindset, and pride in his accomplishments, however small, is going to be really important. So this is a child who will be able to be independent as an adult, but will not do anything related to language. So he will probably just find his niche. It'll still be difficult for this child to graduate. He'll need a lot of support. He's probably always going to struggle to read and write. And like I said, he'll only graduate with like extreme effort. So working on that growth mindset now for this particular child is amazing and very useful. And before I leave you, I want to show you this, which I found and I thought, perfect. Not an LD, not a DD, not an MID, just what I would call optimized. So this is a student who, look at that, not really good at thinking and reasoning. She's all in the range of MID. But look at all these amazing processes that support learning. She has a lot. She has some that are kind of strengths relative to her own ability, but still below the average range. And yet she has a lot of abilities that are kind of hovering in this area here. So no problems here with essay writing. Her spelling is actually much in line. Her reading comprehension is kind of progressing at the maximum level. And her math, reasoning, numerical operations are good. So I would describe this student as someone who needs more examples, more explanation, more practice. And as an academically slower learner, she's just functioning as well as expected. She manages to learn those basic academic skills and she'll continue to struggle with her higher level concepts, but she seems to be functioning as well as expected, if not better. And she's going to continue to struggle over time, but this child, again, you're going to get her to follow her interests. So maybe her interests are more like cutting hair. So make sure she has all the abilities she needs, all of the abilities she needs to be able to do that, and follow like her personal strengths. And her personal strength was her working memory. She can remember things she hears as well as she sees. And that's likely why she's not having a difficulty. She's succeeding at this level because she doesn't have a learning disability. So keep in mind that these kids are still struggling compared to other kids in your class. And so that's where it can get confusing. But this is where we get very happy with her and just say, like, you try your best, and that's all we need from you. And things should go well for her. Also, she has no adaptive skills issues. So this child dresses herself, she has good hygiene, she's very sociable, she participates in the classroom, she's comfortable with regards to her self-esteem, optimized. Thank you. I think we went over. If there's any questions, I can stay.
Hi, Lynn. I just had a question about the math fluency. How is that administered? Like for addition and subtraction?
Yeah, so it's 2 minutes, the 1 minute per. So I have a sheet full of 2 pages full of additions, 2 full of subtractions, 2 full of multiplications. And the child is asked to do as many problems as they can, going from left to right, working as quickly as they can, and go. You have a minute and then stop. Thank you. Let's do this.
Thank you.
And so then we just compare that to the norm.
Well, it's just that there's, you know, a lot of the reading that I've done with basic fact fluency recommends that you don't do speed tests with students. It's more about their ability to think fluidly about numbers, like doing type of mental math and manipulating numbers as opposed to speed.
Yeah, well, that's a good kind of theoretical question. So first of all, when I'm doing the assessment, it's to try and find and prove deficits, and that the deficits are having an impact on the child. So it's a little bit different from that perspective. So it's kind of to substantiate, right? So that, I think there are 2 questions. So I do them for that purpose. But to tell you the truth, I also believe in them within the classroom, especially for kids with LD, not in a competitive format, because that can be embarrassing to kids with LD, but because the more you can improve their fluency on basic tasks, then it eases up the cognitive load to do more difficult tasks. So if you think of doing a multiplication later, okay, when we often start with repeated addition. So if the child is fluent at addition, then it simplifies the task in multiplication. So it's not really like in a competitive format for the fluency, but if we can get them to recognize and do that more quickly, it ends up alleviating some of the cognitive load for them later. And so they get less discouraged.
Thank you.
I am actually a big proponent of fluency in both reading and math, which I know goes against the whole, you know, should make them understand, and you should make them understand. But it shouldn't be at the expense of the other. And I think historically we've done it in a competitive fashion, which has been a bit problematic. If it were, for example, a self-test, so where everyone was kind of starting and then counting for themselves and then writing down, you know, today I did 6 and tomorrow we're going to do it again and I'm going to see if I beat myself. That's good. Without kind of comparing between class members, and without doing it at the front of the class and saying like, okay, ready, set, who's going to get it? That's really tough for kids with LD and puts them at a disadvantage. So I'm not a proponent of that activity, but definitely fluency. Thanks. I'll stop.
Thank you.
I'm gonna look over since we're still here. Share the glossary of meanings for each test area. Yeah, that's in, I can share that. Examples of what each mean. That'll be a little harder. So in the standardized process, all of these test items are privileged and protected. And so we cannot share those exact items. So when I say, for example, table with removing the B, that's not a test item. So it just really depends on my own kind of creativity and being able to come up with that. Definitely a pet peeve of mine. I know some psychologists actually put some test items in the report, and that's completely unethical. And I think they just don't realize it. The idea there is, for example, my kids being tested with that test is probably not valid because I know all the test items. So when something comes up and I like hear a test item information, I'm probably more likely to make sure my kids pay attention to that because I know it's a test item. So it really invalidates. And we try to protect those test items because, and I think one of the test items is actually on EQAO, which is awful for us. Because now the kids are doing it. But we protect it because it's a huge process to go through the standardization and the renorming, which is happening now for the Y4, the new test that's coming out. Was this your question, Alice? Yeah. Fluency. And someone had to leave.
Lynn,
Yep.
do you find that, I don't know if I'm going to say this properly, but I'm thinking when I was looking earlier that if the student is having trouble with like auditory like the quickness of understanding something, with the fact that that would kind of skew the because we're always taught, okay, take time, here's your strategies, you know, make sure the kids have a lot of processing time to do their stuff, whether it's math or spelling or whatever. And I'm often wondering if all the rules that are in for grammar, for example, if that doesn't affect their phonological awareness because they're trying to recall, oh, what was that rule? And then as we know in English, a lot of the rules just don't make sense. They work for a few words, but not for everything. And I often wondered if that makes a difference, because what you're saying is that a lot of the things that you're doing are timed. So if a child, is that just to highlight the fact that they have trouble with processing speed? Am I making myself clear? I'm kind of over.
I'm hearing a lot of different things. So my tests, some of them are timed, some of them are not. So
Yeah.
the numerical operations in math, for example, is untimed. And so if I have a child with a processing speed deficit, I really want to poke my eyes out because I might be there for an hour doing something that other kids do in 10 minutes.
Okay.
So it's not. So we want to see how well they can do in untimed tasks, but we also want to see if the time they require is more than other kids. That's
Okay.
one question. There are various tasks that are timed and others are not. And that's the standard procedure. So I time it when I'm supposed to, and I don't time it when I'm not. And I'm confident that the information I gather is sufficient to try and explain. So some of the visual tasks are timed, some of the visual tasks are not timed.
Because I was looking at that one student and how well they were doing in different areas, and it just came to mind that perhaps it was not that they couldn't do it per se, but
Which
that
one?
they had the very beginning one when the child had so many high, like the stories and all that kind of stuff, and then all of a sudden went down. And I wondered if
all
that
these
was,
areas? Yeah, so that's my job as a psychologist. So what you all need to do is trust me. So when I present the case, that I've gone through that whole thinking and reasoning process to figure out how these different areas are connected. Sometimes they're connected, and I can say, yes, like all of these tests are timed, and every time there's a timed task, he's at a disadvantage.
It's not so much the time that I was worried about. It was just that I was just thinking that I have worked as all the other teachers have in the small group reading groups and things like that. And you find that there's some that if you just take that little extra time, they do seem to come up with the really brilliant kind of answers when they're not under pressure and they're not feeling like highlighted, I guess, you know, the spotlight isn't on them. So no, that was just my
Yeah,
mind was just kind of querying about that, the different things. But thank you.
yeah, everybody's definitely different. And just in relation to what you said, phonological awareness is also a different ability than applying the rules. So just that. And some kids are impacted by the need to take two things into consideration at once, and that would be likely executive functions difficulties. So someone mentioned that with math practices very contrary to the current math practices and beliefs. Yes, welcome to my life. Educational practices come and go and swing one way and swing the other, and no one seems to care about the best psychological thing to do. So, I mean, all I can do is profess that over time, forever, rapidly drilling kids and admitting that at one point it was done poorly is still an effective way to get them to learn the process. There's a lot of research, especially for the lower functioning kids, that if you actually drill ahead of time, that's their way to understanding eventually. So, I mean, keep that in mind, that there's the psychologists and their understanding of learning. And then there's the, Ministry of Education who decides, they come in to practice and what am I going to do to make my mark? And so they want to change things. And so sometimes they actually go with the trend. So if something is trending and another board does it, then we might do that. And there might not be any research base for doing that. There might not be any, might not be any academics who have looked into it to compare whether or not that is something that is going to be useful for the child. And so it is almost just trendy and therefore accepted. So we try to stay away from that because we're scientists at the base. That was my soapbox moment. Are we all done? You have any other questions? Well, thank you for coming. I will end it now.
Okay, thank you so much, Lynn. Have a great
Okay,
weekend. Take care.
thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.